Many wonder if the Nephilim died in the flood of the deluge of Noah's tale. No, they did not. Not by our understanding of what implies as death. You're right, they didn't die in the flood. They were part angelic, which meant that they did not adhere to the rules of death like mortal but instead transitioned into another form like angels do. That was when the second war in heaven began, and the Leviathan, the demon from the Exorcist movies, was created on top of Mount Hermon. The section that says they committed acts of fornication with the mortals occurred just before the floodwaters came was actually a similar ritual used during black masses where people would dance in a ritual around a fire pit shouting obscene sins. The ritual creates a veil that illusions God's ability to observe what is happening during the mass. In this veil the remnant children of the Nephilim who had not been slain by Michael and Gabriel that were ordered to hunt them down, gathered and used their combined power to create the Demiurge, harbinger of destruction and their revenge against God. With that they stormed the walls of heaven with their secret weapon Tiamat, but in the end they lost and Tiamat was cast down by Michael or Marduk. Azazel was imprisoned on top of Mount Hermon and Samael was slain on top of the same mountain by Michael. I have begun to piece together the original event that eventually became known as Noah's tale, but it is far from finished, so I will go over first some perspectives needed to be able to actually grasp this tale's path through the ages. For one, you must realize that just our modern species of Homo sapien man has evolved as a culture from scratching marks of pieces of tree trunk. That would be the beginning of our recorded history to our digital age, technologically advanced, ready to fly to other worlds and begin building colonies in just a short span of 4,000 years. That's all science has to work with as far as definite proof. Everything else, from geological surveys to quantum algorithmic simulations, is just speculation and not finite proof. Geological surveys are no more credible than any other form of mysticism because just as mysticism draws their information from reading the palms, combining the forces of nature and the universe around us and molding it to obey their commands, so too does geology along with most other forms of science read the lines within the rocks and use super colliders to fuse particles together so that they can mold the particles to obey their commands. Honestly, no one can say what really occurred more than 4,000 years ago because there is no recorded documents that can be translated properly beyond that point. Except for a very slim number of highly protected documents that have a very narrow number of possible variations to the story we're given. So instead of attempting to authenticate the age of the document these tales are written upon, I have focused the effort of the process to verifying the supportive evidence and various items that tie these tales together. Most large-scale events, such as one like Noah's tale, do not have only one universally canonized version of an account to the tale. This specific legend gives various details of what exactly happened and was experienced by those that this tale endured. If we go into the cultural accounts beyond the popular version, then we discover that Noah had actually been told this legend many times from various people and had compiled the various tales he had heard into one storyline which he dictated to his son Shem, wrote down the version we all are familiar with. Before that, everything was passed along from one generation to the next, by geological artifacts discovered around the world that keep dating further and further back than anyone thought possible for man to have existed. We slowly come closer and closer to the real scenario that occurred somewhere near to 300 million years ago. New studies suggest that the early stages of Earth was covered in water. This theory does have supporting evidence that is still present and even a part of some cultural backgrounds. In Africa there is a legend of the home of the warrior who stood against Pazuzu that was described to be an ancient monster-like creature similar to a harpy in description. But what is interesting about this legend is the kingdom from which he came from was located in a position that would lead it be, and is actually referred to as, a sky palace that would have been floating at an elevated position right near the southern region of the African plains. I would say, considering the time frame and description, that this floating sky palace would have been the fabled underwater city of Atlantis. Now African religious groups scattered around this area state that though the city is no longer the portion of the bridge that led to this city still is and is located in a highly protected and sacred mountain that was the entrance to the passageway that led to this floating city. As the legends say, after this monster destroyed the floating palace, 9 sky gods descended from the heavens and attacked the creature, driving it towards the north. Somewhere in a mountain range located possibly near Greece, the 9 sky gods used their divine weapons to spear the creature and tied it down, killing it. This latter part of the legend can be found in the cultural tale of the defeat of the gods. Other cultural accounts from India speak of a floating city that attacked the city of Dwarka, and Krishna used his godly power that many described as being some nuclear missile type technology and critically damaged this floating city, causing it to fall from the sky heading towards the western horizon, which would place its crash site to be somewhere around the same location as the Sky Palace of African legend. So from these cultural religious events I would say that our world has been a host to a war between worlds not of our own before in the past. The time frame of these events accounts are the only questionable sections that causes scientists to dismiss them as fiction, but they fail to realize that they are dealing with a culture of people who, at that time when the accounts were transcribed into a written form, had problems keeping track of the number of teeth still in their mouth, let alone being able to accurately perceive how many hundreds if not thousands of years had passed since the time was when these things had occurred. But if recorded man's history only is accurate to 4,000 years ago, then how does a culture in India have recorded accounts of an event that occurred 65 million years ago? In the Rig Veda texts there are details that give an account not only of the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs, but it gives an account of the material from the asteroid that was ejected all over the world, which they called lodesrans, and often would gather them and had a process of purifying the material of its irradiated qualities that if not treated would cause effects to a person similar in description to that of radiation poisoning. Not only that, but their sages had been competent enough to have tracked down where this asteroid came from and knew of its region of origin. The texts describe it to have come from the area of the constellation of Orion. In the tale of the death of Brahma, one of my favorites because it describes the death of an aspect of God, it says that he had observed the approaching asteroid for almost a week before calling forth his court and bringing their attention to its approach, believing it to have been a part of his being, for it came from the region of his godly intangible being. He perceived there to be no harm and went out to greet this visitor. In very descriptive detail the Vedic scribes recorded this impact event that coincides with the asteroid impact 65 million years ago. The scribes say that it resembled a dragon wreathed in flames whose tail whipped about behind it. As it entered the atmosphere, the whipping tail caused it to turn over onto its back, and that suddenly there was a sound like that of a roar 100 times over that could be heard around the world or to the four corners as it plummeted into the ocean off the coast of India, and its two brothers that separated from it as it came into the atmosphere, one went to the west and one to the south. Then suddenly it says that the oceans erupted into a giant tidal surge that caused the ocean god to weep greatly, for most of the life within the oceans died, as did the life upon the earth and the air. Now this is an interesting part. The Vedas and a race that can be associated in description to be that of the jinn of the Arabic culture, were chanting their mantras of power and protection during all this. Afterward Brahma was so pissed that they had failed that he banished the jinn from his court for their failure and removed the Vedic mantras from his presence, forever losing faith in the Vedic art. Still, though, the question as to how these Vedic texts that dates to about 2600 BC managed to record the details of the asteroid impact 65 million years ago is quite puzzling. That is not the oldest account either. There are records of events details that go back as far as possibly 3.5 billion years. The earliest known recorded event is the details of the fall of the lunar goddess that details the time when the moon struck the earth and fell into orbit, becoming our moon. Scientists search the universe for life, but they are focused on carbon-based traces of life, not life in general. They are so focused on what their data dictates is and isn't possible, they have limited their ability to truly be scientists and so limited their potential. If they would simply format a process of simulated possibilities of life evolving beyond the carbon-based cycle and open possibilities to worlds where other elemental factors that support and sustain each other were the dominant element in the planet's atmosphere and given time for evolution to combine and merge these byproducts of the elements and their other various supporting elements until an ecosystem develops to sustain the cycle of these symbiotic elements' cohabitation, eventually the simulated model would produce a description of possible life existing on a much more abundant level than just carbon-based. It's just that simple, barely an inconvenience really. So from what I've gathered from all these perspectives is that just before the flood, according to Vedic texts in the Mahabharata, that there was a war just before the deluge began, caused by what astrologers point towards as a supernova that occurred not far from us, which bathed our world in high dose of neutrinos, which caused a series of events similar to the movie 2012. It destabilized the continental crust and the ocean waters receded into the firmament layer of the crust deep beneath the earth. This event was recorded as the appearance of a bright star in the sky that made it seem like the earth had two suns for a time, and they called it the birth of the sky god, Tristan. This new god brought with it plague and famine as the oceans disappeared. As it did, the volcanic magma chambers around the world emptied because of the pressure from below, with the ocean's waters pushing against it, and every volcano in the world erupted. The emptied magma chambers then collapsed in on themselves, pushing the ocean's waters back up onto the surface as huge geysers of water around the world shot out into the sky and came crashing back down, causing a massive flood event to occur that covered the earth in water. But that wasn't the end. The world grew dark from the volcanic pyroclastic clouds covering the sunlight, but also blocking any more of the neutrino particles from bathing the planet in radiation. The age of the eternal night began that led into the ice age from long ago. The survivors of this traveled towards what was once the northern and southern poles, which had become tropical zones, and abandoned what cities were left. Now at this time before the deluge began, there are multiple accounts of different cultures that tell of a man and a group full of people being out at sea, carried on in boat, and being told by a deity to sail for a temple that was found on top of a mountain. The caption didn't question the information and sailed for the location. As the geysers covered the earth and rose, so did his ship until he was near being able to reach the temple, which rested still above water. Unfortunately, it says he crashed the ship by running into shallow rocks near the shores, and it became unusable. People were still alive, and the temple is called the Kailasa Temple in the Himalayan mountains. The descendants of these survivors became known as the Maori people, who lived on the now sunken island continent that is now New Zealand. That region seems to have suffered much continental drift movement, most likely because of the supervolcano's magma chamber that was in this region that collapsed and may still be collapsing. So the concern for us would be when that region begins to rise again, because that would be a sign that the supervolcano's magma chamber is filling. But I have a feeling that magma chamber has become, and still is, too damaged to retain lava. From recent activity, it seems as though there are multiple cracks around the chamber that seep out to the smaller volcanoes all around the region. NKW. The problem with the text's validity is that the people who survived. Now the confusion in the recorded texts of our history seem to stem from the people in that era associating the creator, who seems to have been present at that time, as being the god, Tristan, and so associated him to all the disasters that befell them. He had tried to warn them, but because of the calamity going on as it unfolded, turned a deaf ear to his warnings, and so he turned to the character of Noah's tale and ensured their survival, as they did not listen to the rantings of the main populace, mainly because it seemed Noah was a drunk, and so he and his family secluded themselves away from the cities in the wilderness. That is what I've put together so far. Now the amazing part of this is that it is astrological evidence that places the supernova that caused this event at being around 300 million years ago. That is enough time to have decayed any sort of building structures as well as any other evidence away. The details of these accounts are similar and scattered across multiple cultures, some giving an account of a different tale of survivors but each facing the same event that occurred long ago. And with a planet that has a 5 billion year old lifespan with 4.5 billion years worth of time that life could have possibly lived on it, regardless of the specifics on the time frame, there is no telling how many advanced civilizations may have come and gone. Like I said, 4,000 years is nothing when comparing against millions, even billions of years of time.
Hitler, Schlüter, Hitler, Hitlers, Goy, Streetakels, Goylar,